Okay, let's get started. We're close to 3:30. So what we are doing today is, among other things, launching a YCAR lecture series on knowledge production in East Asia. And I'm thrilled that we are launching it with a talk by Professor Cynthia Brokaw, who is chair of the Department of History at Brown University. In order for knowledge to be codified, systematized, and disseminated, it has to be textualized. So you can't just have free-floating knowledge, but you have to have knowledge in some kind of a form that it can be passed on and used by others. So it is most fitting, I think, that the first lecture in the series on knowledge production is a preeminent scholar of the Chinese book and of Chinese print culture. From the publication of her first book, which was in 1991, and that book was called The Ledgers of Merit and Demerit, Social Change and Moral Order in Late Imperial China, Cynthia Brokaw has examined the social history of the Chinese book, probing the relationship between text and social change. Her own research has focused mostly on the late imperial, but also the early republican period, so really from the 16th dynasty through to the beginning of the 20th century. And she's co-edited 2 landmark volumes, the first, Printing and Book Culture in Late Imperial China, a rich collection that examines many of the key questions in book history, such as the relationship between manuscript and print, which we've talked about in one of my classes, the rise of reading publics, and the use of visual sources. The second, From Woodblocks to the Internet, Chinese Publishing and Print Culture in Transition, which goes all the way from 1800 to 2008. As the title suggests, goes well beyond late imperial China and examines print capitalism and print in the age of the internet. Her most recent single-authored book is entitled Commerce in Culture, the Sibao Book Trade in the Ching and Republican Periods, and this book is a tour de force. It's huge. I didn't even bring it because it's so heavy. But it is a meticulously researched local history, and this is something we've talked about in my history class, the importance of looking at the local and not just the national level. She includes a tremendous number of oral interviews with surviving members of publishing families. And she combines this with discussions of the implications of this local history for our understanding more broadly of Chinese culture and of the Chinese book. So it is out of this research that her talk today comes, so I will say no more about it. Please join me in welcoming Cynthia Brokaw.
Well, thank you, Joan, for that very generous introduction. Is the sound, can you hear me clearly enough? Okay. I think few people would dispute the special importance of books and the written word in China. Few cultures, in fact, have enjoyed such a long tradition of literary production and scholarship, and few peoples have more consistently expressed their respect for learning and mastery of the written word. By the 10th century at the latest, literacy and education, measured by a government-instituted civil service examination system, were really the gateways to social status, wealth, and political authority. In short, possession of, or at the very least just access to, books was really essential to respectable success in Chinese society. Books came to be highly valued, not just for the information they carried, but also as commodities in their own right, sort of material emblems of culture. Book collecting was a common hobby, not only for scholars, but also for wealthy merchants and landowners aspiring to higher social status. The so-called scent of books lent a household a degree of respectability. Now, in terms of the study of Chinese books, I think it's fair to say that thus far, scholars of the Chinese book have generally focused on books that represent the very peak of Chinese publishing, fine or rare editions that might in fact have been the possession of either very sophisticated scholars and literati or wealthy merchants interested in associating themselves with the scholar official class. In short, these are, for the most part, expensive and finely printed texts whose possession and use were confined to an elite, a small proportion of the total population in the imperial period. Inspired by the very rich scholarship on the social history of the Western book, I'm interested actually in a somewhat different topic. That is how the development of printing and the very high value that is placed on book learning in Chinese society influenced levels of the population that are below this highly educated ruling elite. Did these people have access to books at all? If they did, what kinds of books were they most likely to possess? Were these people reading the same kinds of texts as the elite? Were the same texts popular everywhere in the empire? Or were there marked regional and social differences in reading tastes and levels? These questions, I think, lead naturally then to even larger ones. Did the spread of a flourishing book culture help unite or integrate different regional and socioeconomic groups within Chinese society? To what extent did the spread of book culture and increases in literacy affect the social and political order? Now, I'm not going to answer all, or perhaps not even any, of these questions here today. But I do want to suggest how they might be answered in part, and how these answers might lead us to think a little bit differently about even the history of modern China. By looking at the work of one commercial publishing industry in the Ching, and I probably will go a little bit into the Republican period as well, despite my title, which ends in the Ching. This is the publishing industry of Sibao in western Fujian province. And as Joan has already suggested, the material that I'll be presenting here is based on field work that I did in this area in the 1990s and early 2000s. And by field work, I mean I was collecting primary documents in the publishing villages in Sibao, and then also conducting interviews with the residents, former booksellers and publishers in the area. And one of the things I'd like to do in this talk is give you some idea of the kinds of sources that I was able to collect in doing this sort of work. Okay, the plan of the talk. First, I'd like to briefly contextualize the Sibao industry, explaining how I believe it fits into the larger publishing world of the late imperial period, which I mean here, by which I mean here the late 17th through the early 20th centuries. Next, I'm going to briefly characterize the nature of Sibao's publishing output, and then move to a discussion of the organization and operation of the publishing industry, explaining how the structure of publishing in Sibao shaped decisions about what to publish. And then finally, I'd like to conclude with some sort of general reflections on the impact of Sibao publishing on Chinese book culture and its role as a force for cultural integration and some degree even of social stability. Okay, first, to talk about Sibao and commercial woodblock publishing in the Qing, placing Sibao, this one particular place, in the larger context of the Qing dynasty. The evidence, not only from Sibao, but also from several other hinterland, sort of rural publishing centers, indicates that over the course of the Qing dynasty, there was a thoroughgoing spread of commercial woodblock publishing industries, really in two important different directions. So first of all, geographically, outward, to all regions of China proper. And when I say China proper here, I mean the Chinese part of the Qing Empire. Of course, the Qing Empire is quite vast, and it includes many regions that aren't really very heavily populated by Chinese. I'm really restricting myself in this talk to China proper. First of all, the spread of block printing, again, sort of outward geographically to all the different regions of China proper, and then socially downward to levels of the population that up to that point had really been more or less excluded from the book market. So if we look at this a map of the Ching, again, the territory that I'm really talking about here, again, where largely populated by Han Chinese, and you can see it's also the most densely populated part of the Qing Empire. And I am talking very generally about the spread of publishing industries from the eastern coastal region to the interior, and again into rural and hinterland regions. The publishing boom of the late Ming that began, say, in the mid-16th century and lasted through the mid-17th century, at least on the production side, was centered in just a handful of sites, a handful of cities, pretty much on the eastern coastal area. In this area, the lower Yangtze Delta region, the cities of Nanjing, Suzhou, and Hangzhou in the lower Yangtze Delta region, and then also one rural area in northern Fujian province. But really, it's just this little slice of China proper here that was the dominant site of book production in the late Ming. But by the 18th century, at the latest, commercial woodblock publishing industries were, as I've suggested, diffused throughout China proper. And not only, again, spread geographically, but diffused at all different levels of settlement, from peasant villages to market towns to provincial capitals, up to major metropolitan centers, including, of course, the capital of Beijing itself. Now, I think to some extent, this extension of publishing outward and downward was a kind of natural unfolding of the publishing boom of the late Ming, made possible in large part by the simplicity, portability, and flexibility of woodblock print technology. But it was also, of course, driven by demographic and social changes that are very distinctive to the Qing period. The very considerable population growth of the 18th century sort of naturally increased the demand for books, while migration to hinterland and frontier areas, particularly in the Southwest, served both to diffuse demand, as of course populations moved again to the southwestern part of China proper, and to transmit the skills and technology of woodblock printing, as block cutters and printers also migrated to these areas. Again, areas that had previously been only very lightly served by commercial publishers. Okay, now to move on to the case that I'm dealing with here, that of Sibao and the commercial publishing in the hinterland. It is in the context of this geographical expansion of publishing and this deeper social penetration of texts that I think Sibao becomes important, becomes very significant. Sibao, at first glance, I have to say, does not itself seem to have been a very significant place, either politically, socially, economically, or culturally. It was, in the Qing, a distinct geographical and cultural unit, a cluster of poor Hakka villages in the mountains of western Fujian, far distant from any cultural or economic or political center. It's so insignificant that it doesn't even appear on this map of Fujian province. But I can tell you it's located near the county seat of Changting, the seat of Changting County. Sibao is roughly in this area here, so far western Fujian. And again, this is a very mountainous portion of a very mountainous province. By the way, the Hakka, although they are in fact Han Chinese, were considered an ethnic minority. They spoke a distinctive dialect called Hakka or Kejia, and practiced certain customs that, in a sense, distinguished them from their neighbors. So they were identified as a sort of particular ethnic group, certainly by the 19th century. Now, two villages within this Sibao area, the Sibao Basin, were the major sites of publishing. Wuge, which is the home of the Zhou lineage publishers, and Mawu, home of the Ma lineage publishers. Zhou and Ma publishing houses were first established in these two different villages in the 1660s. The publishing industry actually persisted in this area for over 2.5 centuries. The last Sibao publishing house finally stopped printing only in 1946, and the last bookstore selling Sibao imprints in 1956. Now, of course, by that time, the industry was in very steep decline, but they do manage to hold on until the 1940s and even the mid-1950s. Now, what kinds of texts did these publishers produce? What contributions were they making to Chinese print culture in this long period? Well, to give you a very brief overview of Sibao's book list, I've identified 3 very broad categories of texts to talk about: educational texts, practical how-to manuals, and fiction. So first, the educational texts. These were the real staples of the Sibao book trade, so popular that even just a few editions could support an entire household. For example, Ma Dingbang, who lived from 1672 to 1743, one obviously of the Ma lineage of Ma Wu, and the founder of a very successful publishing house in the late 17th century, established himself and supported his household through the production of just 6 educational texts, 4 different editions of the 4 books, which were the basic textbooks of the civil service examination system and thus extremely popular and in great demand, 1 edition of the classic of poetry, one of the 5 Confucian classics, again, very much an examination textbook, and then 1 elementary reading primer for teaching people how to read. Now, the general category of educational texts includes not only works like this, edition of the classics and primers, but also all sorts of examination study aids as well: dictionaries, collection of model examination essays, encyclopedias of the classics, histories, because it was also important to have knowledge of Chinese history if you were going to succeed on the examinations, and so on and so forth. So it's in some ways a very broad category. I show here two examples, again, of texts in what I would call the basic literacy primer category. First of all, this Sibao edition of the 3-character classic. You can see that it's divided into 3 characters. It's a series of rhymed couplets. This is perhaps the most popular primer in Imperial China. It's published by many, many different publishing houses, really a kind of ubiquitous primary educational text. And this is the Sibao, very basic Sibao edition of it. Actually rather nicely cut. The characters actually don't look too bad. But you can see this illustration of, I think, a teacher standing behind a desk and listening to, I think this is a student holding the text in his hand, reciting it. But the illustration is clearly much cruder than the characters. Another primer, this is actually a glossary of terms, with also some terms that are illustrated, every day. And again, it's really just a list of vocabulary items that the beginning student would learn. And here the illustrations are matched then with the character that identifies what's in the illustration. Although, as you can see, the illustrations, again, are rather crude. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out what they are. So the character is actually what tells you what they are rather than the picture. So 2 very basic educational works published by Sibao. Moving up a bit to a different level, this is an edition of the 4 books titled 4 Books with Supplementary Commentaries and Complete and Exhaustive Compendia of References. Here, the very basic text of the work is the Mencius, one of the 4 books. And I don't know how clearly you can see, but the big characters here, there are characters that are significantly larger than others. That's the basic text of the Mencius. That gives you the basic classic, again, one of the 4 books, in the bottom register. And then this is surrounded by smaller characters that give you the orthodox commentary, the commentary that the state had identified as the correct interpretation of the Mencius. Then the two top registers offer more detailed commentary and analysis. The middle one here is another explanation of the text, a simplified explanation of the commentary down here in vernacular Chinese. And then the very top level identifies place names and the names of people that appear in the classic. It's, of course, very difficult to determine who would read a text, who would use a text just on the basis of its contents. And this is, I think, particularly true in the case of China, where we generally lack very precise information about who was reading what. But I think it's safe to say that this text was designed as a guide for examination study, a kind of crib, if you want to think of it that way, on the Mencius. The cramped page and the flattened characters make it a very unpleasant book to read. So again, I would interpret this as a kind of cram book on the Mencius, most likely designed either for an ambitious but rather poor student who couldn't afford a better edition, or perhaps a village teacher, unsure of his own learning, who needed a kind of text that would tell him how to explain the text to his students. Now, not all of Sibao's educational texts were oriented toward examination study. This text, titled Writing Letters, Distinguishing Characters, in its preface advertises its usefulness to a readership not really of classical scholars, but of merchants and traders. This is designed in part to help students learn to distinguish easily confused characters. The preface that opens with a testimonial from an unidentified customer who explains that his own father had ordered him to abandon his studies at the age of 18 in order to work as a merchant, or to travel to distant places as a merchant, as he says. Now, as an adult, he bitterly regrets the resulting deficiencies in his education. Whenever I have to write anything, I cannot distinguish clearly the forms of the different characters. I scratch my head, bitterly wasting much time and energy trying to think of the right character. When he returns home from one of his trading trips to visit his family, he's shocked and very distressed to see that his own son, who has been studying for 5 years, has the same problem that he had when he was a student. He can't distinguish between Bu and Bo, or Hui and Zheng. These characters, you can see, they do look rather alike, but they're pronounced differently and mean very different things. The son procures a copy of Writing Letters, Distinguishing Characters, and after a mere month of study, is able to pass an extensive test of his ability to read accurately. That only 1 month of work would be enough to supplement 5 years of study. This is indeed extraordinary, marvels the proud father. And then he goes on to praise the clarity and convenience of this textbook. Now, the top register here is what gives you the guide to distinguishing characters that look alike. And I have to say, I very much wish I had had an opportunity to use a text like this when I was learning Chinese. Still would find something like this rather handy, frankly. One of the things that's interesting about this text is it's actually 2 texts in one. The top part is, again, this kind of dictionary of easily confused characters, and the bottom is something completely different. The bottom register is titled 10 Important Principles for Embarking on a Profession, and it states the first principle is knowing how to read, knowing how to use the abacus, and knowing how to distinguish between grades of silver are the most important skills. If, as a merchant, you have these skills, you will do well. If you don't, you will do poorly. And then what follows, these 10 principles, are a whole series of model forms for business letters. The popularity of this text, of course, speaks both to the expansion of the reading audience and to the larger acceptance of commerce as a respectable profession in imperial China. Such works would not have been produced by commercial publishers like the Zhou and the Ma men, after all, who were interested in making a profit, unless they knew that there was a very lively market for them. Now, educational texts, as I've suggested, dominated Sibao's book list throughout its publishing history. But a second sort of category of imprints, practical how-to manuals, also occupied a pretty large share of their output. These were really books that weren't so much designed to be read through, but to be used as sort of reference works, to be consulted, again, when confronted with certain problems of daily life. Household encyclopedias and letter-writing handbooks, manuals defining the rituals of family life and the rules of polite social intercourse, prescribe proper behavior and etiquette, often in very, very minute detail. Here, for example, is a page from the Collected Essential Models for Family Rituals. And what this page does is provide a kind of mourning chart that tells you what you should wear after the death of a family, a member of your family or lineage. And you find out where you belong on this chart, where in what degree of relationship you enjoy to the deceased. And then the little box tells you then what you should be wearing in mourning for that person. This work also includes instructions on terms of address. 158 different terms of address and self-reference are listed for the 42 different relationships one might have with members of one's mother's lineage. This is only a part, of course, of a very extensive family organization. And it also includes model letter forms for a variety of different situations and correspondence, how husbands should write letters to their wives, wives to husbands, fathers to sons, sons to fathers, how friends should write letters asking friends for loans, and quite helpfully, a form for friends who want to refuse to give their friend a loan. So again, a wide variety of different social situations and goals of correspondence are included here. Now, within this category of practical how-to texts, I would also place medical and pharmaceutical manuals, both for sort of do-it-yourself diagnosis and cure, or for use by village physicians, rural practitioners. They include, for example, collections of rhyming prescriptions for easy memorization, guides to the symptoms of various diseases. This particular book, the cover page, Collected Acute Diseases of Internal and External Medicine, published by the Wubantang. That's just the name of one Sibao publishing house. And it contains, as you can see from this next slide, descriptions of the symptoms of diseases, and then these helpful illustrations. Actually, I'm not quite sure how helpful they are, but they're intended to be helpful to illustrate how you identify what certain diseases are, and then a little description gives you some idea of how these might be cured. Here is another such text, but in this case designed for veterinary use. A page from Cures for Water Buffaloes by Yuan and Hung. Those are the names of the two authors. And this page is illustrating this poor water buffalo writhing in agony here in the picture, and then the description explains what's wrong with him and what one should do to cure him. Like all texts in this sort of how-to category, these works advertise their applicability to everyone, everywhere, yet I think in a rhetoric that reveals that they were really intended for a rural readership of very modest means. For example, here is an excerpt from the preface to the new collection of efficacious prescriptions, again, one of these prescription manuals that I mentioned. There is no one who does not get sick, but physicians at times are hard to get. Medicine at times is too expensive. The poor will often be wringing their hands in anxiety over them. In order to ensure the greatest convenience, every household should have a copy of this text. It supplies a prescription for every sickness and a medicine for every prescription. Moreover, these prescriptions need not cost even 1 cash, and yet are miraculously efficacious. Even though you live in an isolated rural area, one that rarely sees a boat or horse, you will still be able to find the necessary medicines. Now, within this category of how-to texts, there's also a group of texts that I would call how-to guides to good fortune. This group includes geomancy manuals, that is feng shui manuals, that is works that explain how to site graves, the burials of one's ancestors in order to bring good fortune to the family. Illustrated guides to physiognomy, how you read the physical features of the face and deduce from them one's fortune. The casting of horoscope and the drawing of charms. Morality books, and then almanacs that advertise a kind of good fortune through very careful scheduling. And here I'll show you an example of one of these almanacs, again, a very, very popular book, The Record of the Jade Casket. This book includes a calendar of lucky and unlucky days so that a reader would be able to look up what would be a good day for getting married, or what would be a good day for burying one's recently deceased father. But it's also a guide to lucky days for quite mundane activities, like a good day to wash your hair. So an extremely useful, sort of broadly applicable guide to choosing the proper days for the activities of daily life. This text also provides, as you see here, pictures of a large array of different spirits with brief explanations of how each might be useful to a suppliant and what the most efficacious time and form of worship would be for each. Okay, my final category of text consists largely of fiction. This group includes the very famous vernacular novels of the late Ming and the Ching, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, Journey to the West, and Dream of the Red Chamber. But by far the most popular texts in this category were popular historical novels and martial arts romances, stories of famous historical figures like UFA or Judge Bao, stories that have been highly fictionalized because in these novels, these men become almost gods. I mean, they have supernatural powers that allow them to defeat any enemy. Also very popular were scholar beauty love stories. And also very popular are songbooks, rather cheap pamphlet-like texts that were used as prompt books in performances of such famous narrative songs as the tragic love story of Liang Shangbo and Zhu Yingtai. And this very crudely illustrated and very badly printed sheet from this story, from Liang Shangbo and Zhu Yingtai, gives you some idea of the quality of this particular kind of popular fictional texts. Again, obviously not particularly well cut and certainly not very well printed. Now, to conclude this very, very brief overview, I want to make 3 points about this body of Sibao imprints, again, that will sort of place them in the context of late imperial publishing and suggest something of Sibao's target audience. First, the overwhelming majority of the texts that Zhou and Ma published were universally popular works. They constituted what I call the common core of Chinese book culture, texts that would have been in demand throughout the empire. They're not publishing edgy, creative and very new and exciting texts. They're publishing texts that they know they're going to be able to sell. The Zhou and Ma publishers were choosing then to produce the perennial bestsellers of Chinese book culture. Again, works they knew they could sell anywhere, anytime. Second, there is a remarkable stability in the content of Sibao's output over the course of the 2.5 centuries in which they're in operation. Now, new titles are added from time to time, particularly in the fiction category, but generally speaking, the Zhou and the Ma were publishing the same texts and certainly the same types of texts at the very end of their long business history in the 1940s as they were in the late 17th century when they're starting up. Third and finally, by and large, Sibao texts were poorly produced, small in size, printed on coarse bamboo paper from blocks that were crammed with crudely cut characters and often full of mistakes. To give you a sense of just how poorly produced they were, let me show you one or two examples of high-quality texts published by woodblocks in the late imperial period. I would not want you to think that Sibao's texts are representative of Chinese woodblock publishing. They aren't. So here, I'll just show you some texts that are representative of the high, the peak of Chinese woodblock publishing. This is a Song Dynasty edition of poetry. Again, I think you can see quite beautifully and finely cut and very clearly printed. This exquisite color printed illustration to the Record of the Western Chamber, one of the most popular dramas of the late imperial period. This is a 17th century, very famous edition, and again, it's color printed. And then this text, again, rather recent, it's the early 20th century, but I think you can see that the characters are very well cut, and this is a very nicely printed text, and printed too on high quality, nice white paper that takes the impression sharply. Or to make a somewhat more direct comparison, here are two different editions of the same work, the three-character classic of medicine, a kind of basic medical textbook. And here on the right, this is the Sibao edition, and on the left, from another commercial publisher. This isn't a beautiful edition. This isn't as nice as the text that I just showed you, but it's still much nicer than the Sibao edition. I think you can see the characters are clearer, they're more nicely cut, and it's a much easier text to read than the kind of crude and choppy Sibao text. Or again, to return to the Record of the Jade Casket, here the Sibao edition compared to another edition from a commercial publisher. Again, not a very high quality edition, but I think you can see very clearly the difference. The iconography is roughly the same, but this is a much more simplified. They've cut out a lot of the detail here in that the Sibao edition. It's much more crudely presented. So, not surprisingly then, Sibao imprints were usually quite inexpensive. An inventory account book that I unearthed in Sibao. This dates from the late 19th century. Very difficult to read. It was not preserved very well, but this gives you an abbreviated title of the text. Oh, I'm sorry, here, the number of copies that they have, abbreviated title, and then the cost, the wholesale cost of the text. Working through this text, I've been able to reconstruct some of the prices, again, as low as 5 li wholesale for versions of the 3-character classic and the 1,000-character essay, which is another very common primer. 3 fun wholesale for an edition of 300 poems of the Tong and simply annotated editions of the Classic of Changes and the Classic of History. Of the 379 titles that I've been able to decipher on this account book, almost exactly half are under 1 cash. And as one of my informants explained to me, our texts were so cheap that anyone could buy them. Now, I'd like to turn to the structure of the Sibao publishing bookselling industry and consider what drove these particular publishing choices and why these publishers chose, again, this particular book list. I would argue that these choices were to a considerable degree shaped by their location and the actual organization, the structure of their lineage industry. Publishing began in the Sibao area as a subsidiary handicraft, that is, as a means of supplementing an inadequate agricultural income in a remote and very poor region. The fact that Western Fujian was home to a flourishing paper industry and produced all the natural resources that you needed to do woodblock publishing. They had wood that was suitable for the production of woodblocks, pine for making ink, and as I said, it was in the middle of a paper-producing region. And this, of course, helped a great deal. They were in the right context. It's almost as if a publishing industry would naturally suggest itself to them, given where they were located. Once the simple technology of woodblock printing was introduced to the region in the mid-17th century by sojourning laborers, that is, by men of the Zhou and Ma lineages who returned home after working as block cutters in neighboring Guangdong province, it was quite natural that the very poor inhabitants of Wuge and Mawu would turn to publishing bookselling as means of supplementing, again, their very meager agricultural yields. Like many other handicraft industries in South China, the Sibao publishing bookselling concerns were organized as household businesses within these large corporate lineages, the Zhou and Ma corporate lineages. And by large here, I mean one of these lineages might have several thousand people in it. So these are large social organizations. These households usually included several nuclear families. The largest of them might total as many as 80 people. The household patriarch was usually the manager of the print shop, with his brothers, sons, and nephews working as block cutters, printers, and booksellers. Here, by the way, is a picture of a woodblock. This is actually the woodblock for the production of that songbook I showed you, Liang Shangbo and Juing Tai. Women and children within the household also helped out, performing the low-skill tasks of printing and binding. Book production actually took place right in the household in small stall-like printing rooms that were organized around a courtyard, an open courtyard, in the center of which was placed a large stone basin. It's actually more like, looks a little bit like a bathtub. Some of them still survive in Sibao, that could be filled with printing ink. Here I just have a few tools of the printing trade have survived from Sibao. Here you see the pans in which the ink would be put, or water to clear the brushes, and then here are several different types of printing brushes. I can try to explain the whole process of woodblock publishing in the Q&A if you like. The main advantage of this kind of household-centered book production was, of course, that it kept costs down. Only rarely would a publisher have to hire cutters or printers outside their own family, outside their own household. This was essential, as the Sibao publishers did not have much capital to invest in their businesses. Indeed, I think one of the attractions of publishing for them must have been the fact that as long as they resigned themselves to producing inexpensive and not particularly beautiful texts, the capital that they needed for starting up a publishing house wasn't really all that great. Since Sibao was so isolated, remember it's in a mountain region, it was necessary to transport books outside of the area for sale if any reasonable profits were to be made. Once again, household members, usually sons, brothers, or nephews of the publishing house manager, were sent out either as itinerant booksellers or as managers of branch bookstores, which were established throughout South China. Here is an excerpt from a genealogy of the Ma lineage that reveals actually an exception to the generalization I've just made. Here in 1687, the father, Ma Chuanhong, who is just starting up a publishing operation with his inheritance. His own father has just died and left him some money. And he uses it to print up copies of 4 very popular primers and textbooks, again, educational books. And he himself goes off to sell these texts in Guangdong province, south of Fujian province, leaving his son, Ma Dingbang, who at this point is really only 16 years old, to manage the print shop. So the father's the one who's going out to sell the text, leaving his teenage son back home to manage the actual publishing operation. And this is what Ma Dingbang does. the father left 2 reels of paper as capital to supply the daily needs of the family. This paper was worth 3 cash. Ma Dingbong, the son, used it to print texts. When all of these had been sold, he went into the mountains to buy more paper, which he carried back himself and again used to print up text. He continued this cycle, and the family never suffered hunger or cold, all on the strength of these 2 reels of paper. Later, as a result of his labors, his younger brother was able to marry. Thus, those 2 reels of paper were made into 10 million. Ma Chuan-hong, the father, distant from home, could begin to feel no anxiety about his family. So this young man is a very enterprising young man, obviously. And indeed, he goes on to found one of the most successful of the Ma family print shops. So members of the publishing households both produced and marketed and sold books. In the late 17th century, the booksellers sold largely to schools in Western Fujian. So when the business is starting up, their real customers are the schools in the surrounding area. But over time, they gradually developed much more extensive routes of book selling. At the height of the business, they covered a very impressive territory, including 9 of the provinces of South China, stretching east from Fujian to Yunnan in the far west. The cross-hatching here designates the provinces where they had their most dense networks of sale. And then here in Hunan and Hubei, Guizhou and Yunnan, they're selling texts, but not quite as many as they are in the other provinces. Individual booksellers might cover as many as 5 different provinces on their book-selling circuits. Now, the structure of the industry also created a pressure for the gradual expansion of sales networks to neighboring provinces and for the continual search for new markets. Because of the nature of Chinese property division customs, publishing houses were divided up on the death of the household patriarch, or at any other time that the household decided to divide its property. Property division documents record the divvying up of woodblocks as well as land and houses. Here is one page from a property division document dated from 1839, and it lists the titles of the woodblocks, the books that the woodblocks could be used to print, that were to be given to one of the sons of this man, Ma Cui-zhong, who was the manager of the Zaizetang. So this is just one page from this rather extensive document. There are 15 different titles listed here, and the total in the whole document is 107 different titles. 4 new publishing houses were formed from one publishing house as a result of this property division. And as publishing houses proliferated in this way, of course, their managers had to extend old networks and create new networks of sale simply in order to stay afloat. This pressure helps to explain, I think, the gradual extension or expansion of Sibao markets, first from Fujian, and all of the places named here are sites where they had branch shops or where they regularly traveled to sell their books, to Guangdong province, probably their richest market, and then west from Guangdong through Guangxi province here to the far western tip of Guangxi province. Then also from Fujian to Jiangxi province, and then eventually to Hunan and Hubei, or Huguang in the Ching. Evidence for the founding of the different shops was found in the genealogies of the lineages, and here is just one page from the generational tables in the Zhou lineage that records the founding of a branch shop in Wenzhou in Zhejiang province by a member of the Zhou lineage. Now, this pressure to develop new markets also helps to explain the gradually deeper social penetration of Sibao bookselling. Zhou and Ma book merchants tended to avoid selling their works in metropolitan centers, which usually had their own relatively sophisticated publishing industries. They focused their efforts rather on intermediate and lower levels of settlement, often in hinterland areas. Prefectural and county seats, the sites of government schools and government offices, offered particularly good markets for their textbooks, for example. But increasingly from the mid-18th through the early 20th centuries, the booksellers began to seek out even lower level settlements, market towns and peasant villages as markets. For example, one of my informants, a man in his 80s, reported having worked with his father and uncle as a book peddler in the 1920s and 1930s, carrying 2 loads of books, each load weighing roughly 70 pounds. And the books would be carried in these book boxes, one at each end of a shoulder pole. The father, uncle, and son traveled on a circuit of market towns and villages in Fujian, timing their arrival with that of the periodic market days in these different towns, and displaying their texts in a temporary market stall, or simply by spreading them out on a bamboo mat on the ground, as this watercolor of a bookseller illustrates. Books actually, interestingly, are still sold this way in certain areas of rural China. When I lived in the village of Wuge, I was quite delighted to see on market day an itinerant bookseller displaying cheap copies of the classic of Changes, horoscope manuals, sensational novels, and biographies of Bill Gates and Marilyn Monroe on a bamboo mat that was spread out on the ground. So here, the Zhou and the Ma were taking books deep into the hinterland to villages not served by a permanent bookstore and whose residents thus relied on itinerant booksellers sort of passing through for the purchase of texts. Here is a page from an account book of one such itinerant bookseller. He's noted here the place where he's selling books, and then identified the unit, and they're usually either lineage schools or bookstores in the area. Then he lists the name of the person, his customer, here, and then an abbreviated title, and then here again how much money is owed. And of course, the growth of Sibao's markets at the lower end of the book buying spectrum, where people couldn't really afford very costly texts, encouraged the continued production of texts that could be sold very cheaply, of the sort of rather shabby works that Sibao seems to have specialized in. Now, I should emphasize here that although I focused on the Zhou and Ma publisher booksellers, Sibao was not by any means unique among South China publishing sites, either in its production of relatively inexpensive, universally popular texts, or in its distribution of these texts over an extensive geographical area and down to the lowest social levels of the population. My preliminary research on publishing in Xuan, market town in Jiangxi province, Baoqing prefecture in Hunan, and Yuezhi county in Sichuan suggests that there were many such sites in the Ching dynasty. And to give you just a very crude idea of what the places I'm talking about here, Xuan is roughly here in Jiangxi province, sort of northern Jiangxi province. Baoqing, more or less, well, that's Hubei, here in Hunan, sort of central Hunan province, and Yuezhi in eastern Sichuan province. So again, sort of scattered in different places in China proper. Foreign observers, too, noted the impact of this widespread distribution. To cite just one such testament, W.H. Medhurst in the 1830s commented on the easy availability of books in China. Books are multiplied at a cheap rate to an almost indefinite extent, and every peasant and peddler has the common depositories of knowledge within his reach. Okay, now to conclude, I want to reflect a little on the impact that the Sibao industry and trade, and others like it, most likely had on Chinese book culture and Chinese society in the Qing. Well, first of all, I would argue rather simply and perhaps rather obviously that the Zhou and Ma booksellers were promoting literacy even as they were profiting from it. although there is a very heated debate about the nature of literacy and the rate of literacy in late imperial China, I think most scholars would agree that both the increase in schools and the expansion of publishing from the late 16th century on led to the growth and spread of literacy. I mean, there's a great deal of controversy over what the rate was, but I think there's a general agreement that there is an increase. The Zhou and Ma were certainly active in encouraging improved literacy in the rural and hinterland areas of the South. Second, excuse me, the Sibao publisher-booksellers, by disseminating the universally popular texts of Chinese book culture to the growing population of the southern hinterland and southern frontiers, were acting too as agents of cultural integration. By bringing the primers and classics to prefectural capitals and county seats, market towns, and even peasant villages, they were helping to create a culture integrated both across status lines and regional boundaries. Arthur Smith, remarking on what he saw as a high degree of cultural integration in late 19th century China, observed that the classical wisdom of the ancients is the common heritage of all the sons and daughters of Han, from emperors to old women, and one stratum of society can quote them as well as another. Now, Smith here is talking, when he says the ancients, I'm pretty sure he means the classics. So he's talking really about tags from the classics. But it was, of course, not just the classical wisdom that the Zhou and Ma were transmitting, but also guides to ritual practice and etiquette, popular stories and songs, that just as much as the classics contributed to the common store of cultural reference that helped create an integrated culture. There is no doubt then that the Zhou and Ma were, by spreading culture, which is how they explain their mission in their genealogies. They're very proud of the fact that they're spreading culture, or spreading civilization throughout China proper. They were helping, unwittingly no doubt, to strengthen the identification of their target audiences with Chinese culture, to draw them into a relatively unified, distinctively Chinese cultural sphere. Now, I wouldn't want to get too carried away here, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that there is any sort of uniformity, absolute uniformity here. There are many things that complicate this cultural integration and the common nature of this core of universally popular works. First of all, there is, again, the very obvious fact that works can be read differently by different people. This group of universally popular works contained texts that had rather different messages depending on how you read them. Certainly the message of a work like The Water Margin, which celebrates the bandit life, is rather different from that of the four books, the ultimate promoters of a kind of staid Confucian morality. So there is considerable variety within this sort of common core of universally popular works. I should also say that at the same time there was this common core of popular texts, there were other book cultures in existence in China and China proper at the time. There was, of course, an elite book culture composed of fine and expensive editions and of fast-breaking works conveying the latest literary fashions or the hottest and most controversial contemporary scholarship. I would put the works of the great philologists of the great Ching, of the High Ching, into this category. And these works would not have been available to most of Sibao's readers. And in addition to that sort of elite book culture, there was also a local or regional book culture consisting of specialized imprints, either texts produced by local residents for local consumption, or texts written in a local dialect, or the poetry collections of an obscure local author. All these different texts had very much a local and a regional significance, but wouldn't really be part of this common core of culture. I would put in this category, again, the Cantonese wooden fish books that are in the Cantonese dialect and produced in the Pearl Delta region, or some of the Hakka songbooks that are actually sold by the Zhou and the Ma publishers. So I don't want to present a very simple story of just this one huge, unified, universally popular culture. There are many other things going on here as well. These two other book cultures, the elite and the local or regional, helped maintain and perpetuate status distinctions based on access to knowledge and distinctive local cultural and linguistic traditions, even as the Common Core textual tradition promoted cultural integration. A comment that James Watson has made about the Chinese ritual system applies, in my view, to Ching book culture, or Ching Chinese book culture as well. It, quote, was so flexible that those who called themselves Chinese could have their cake and eat it too. They participated in a unified, centrally organized culture and at the same time celebrated their local or regional differences, and I would hear their status differences as well. This flexibility supported cultural and to some degree social stability. Elite and local book cultures justified claims for some individual and regional distinctiveness. At the same time, the dominance of the Common Core of universally popular texts, again, that certainly formed the bulk of the Zhou and Ma business, ensured widespread participation in a stable, powerful, and highly integrated universal Chinese culture. Thank you very much. I would be very happy to answer questions if anybody. Yes?
Okay. As I was listening to you, I was trying to think of something comparable in the West. I don't know enough about it in China or the West, but when you think about publishing nowadays, both in China and the West, you think of the biggest cities. Mm-hmm. In China, you think of, in addition to Beijing, Shanghai, the provincial capitals where universities are. In America, it's New York. In Chicago, are almost all publishing. Is there anything comparable to something like the Sibao? I mean, we have local, in North America, local printers who do, like you said, the poetry of someone you've never heard of before. But do we have anything like Sibao that's publishing classics only for a local market?
A local? I probably don't know enough about Western book culture to answer that well. The only thing that occurs to me, and it's doesn't fit quite the criteria that you mentioned, but it's fascinated me, and I've often actually thought of maybe doing a comparative piece, are the publishers who produce the Bibliothèque Bleue, the blue books, or whatever, however you want to translate that, in France. And they're centered in the Troyes area. Again, please forgive my French, it's execrable, but in this one place in France. And they're like the Sibao publishers in that they're producing fairly shabby, very, very popular texts. I mean, obviously, they're not producing Chinese classics, but they're producing, saints' hagiographies and popular stories. But interestingly, their markets seem to be the cities. They're centered in to some extent, there are publishers working in the rural area around the city, but their markets seem to be very urban, and in that, I think they're rather different.
I was thinking when you were talking, it's sort of like when I was a kid, once a week you could give some money at the supermarket and you'd get Funk and Wagnall's encyclopedia. So you get all the knowledge of the world, which is what an encyclopedia is about, but it could be anywhere in North America.
Right,
I don't know where they were, but those were published probably all in New York or someplace. So I
would guess so. So I guess I really don't know of something that seems, and frankly, that's one of the things that fascinates me about Sibao and some of the other sites I'm looking for hinterland, rural areas, and they're quite a few. Obviously, a lot of it has to do with the natural resources that are available, and again, I would argue, in a sense, the easiness of the technology. You don't need heavy machinery, you don't need sophisticated technological skills, and therefore, in some ways, it's a very transportable craft. Yes?
Would you happen to know if there was any book culture present in places like Xinjiang and within the Uyghur or the Chinese who were there?
Right. I wish I could answer that question. It's a very good question, and I hope that someday we'll be able to answer it. You mean works in Chinese?
Works in both Chinese and in
Uyghur. The only thing I don't know of any publishing industries in Xinjiang, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I mean, I haven't really looked into it. But there has been some work done on publishing in non-Han languages by the Ching government, mostly in Beijing. And there are some texts that were apparently published in Uyghur as well, in Tibetan, Mongol, Manchu, and actually some texts that are what's the word? In several different languages. So if you want to learn how to read Manchu, they give you the Chinese, and then they give you the Manchu, or then the Mongol. So multilingual dictionaries in some ways. But as far as I know, those were sponsored by the Qing state. And again, as far as I know, they were actually published in Beijing, not in Xinjiang. I do know, this isn't Xinjiang, obviously, but in Tibet, there were several monasteries that were famous for publishing the Tibetan Tripitaka, the Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist sort of canon, from woodblock. So Tibetan publishing was done both in Beijing and actually in certain sites in Tibet, and actually in western Sichuan, Dege or Darge was and still is a kind of Tibetan printing center. But I don't know about enough about Uyghur publishing. If you want, I can give you the one reference I do know of that talks a little bit about that, and that might be helpful.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. I have a couple of related questions.
Mm-hmm.
First, I feel so sorry about those guys with 140 pounds crates dangling from their shoulders, treading over those mountain roads all the way from Fujian to Yunnan. Yeah. Would you know if they were following basically a Hakka-speaking trading route? Mm-hmm. Okay. They were?
I don't know for sure, but one of the things I did in the longer study was look at the pattern of Hakka migration from Sibao and then sort of tried to match it with what we know about their book-selling routes. Yeah. And I concluded from that yes, they were following, in a sense, Hakka paths of migration. Not always. I mean, there's some places they go that there's no evidence that any Zhou or Ma migrated to those areas or any Hakka migrated to those areas. But I think particularly in the beginning, when they're just starting to develop these routes, mm-hmm. they're very much looking for other members of these two lineages, yeah. and then failing that, other Hakka peoples, excuse me, and in those places, that's where they want to establish their roots. They also had to develop some sort of system of banking, and again, they seem to have been looking for Hakka settlements, and they would develop a relationship with one family that would hold on to their stock, or again, hold money for them as they were developing their sales routes. So I think the Hakka connection was crucial to the development of their business. Yeah.
From your from the account sheet that you projected, I'm sure they were selling on credit?
Yes, like the booksellers, the rural bookseller account book, mm-hmm. the sums. I don't think that was the price of the book. It was how much he was owed. Okay. So yes, he was coming back to sort of collect.
Did they have difficulty collecting afterwards?
I don't know. I don't know of any. That was the sort of information that was very difficult to collect, yeah. to get. But okay. I didn't hear any accounts of. I'm sure they did, but I don't have any stories about that. Yeah.
Now, my second question is this: the fiction that they sold. What language was the fiction written in? Was it Hakka or what?
As far as I know, it was Chinese. It was, vernacular Chinese or classical Chinese, depending on, a lot of the beauty scholar romances are actually in classical Chinese, although it's very simple classical Chinese. Yeah. But then they also published vernacular novels like, Shui Hu Zhuang, Water Margin, and
that's
big.
Like,
pardon?
That's big. There's a big volume.
Big, very big volumes. In most of the woodblocks that were used in the industry have been destroyed or shipped to the printing museum in Beijing, but you can still find some woodblocks. And one gentleman showed me he had a kind of a loft where he had stacks and stacks and stacks of woodblocks for the Sangguoyeni, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So yes, they I've seen a copy of the book, and it's very poorly printed. It's not a book that you would enjoy reading. It's hard to read, but they did do the whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, let me explain where that question is coming from. In the 1970s, I was given free rein in the cage of the Orientalia division of the Library of Congress.
Oh, yes.
And
You were
I
very
spent a
lucky.
lot of time climbing up and down bookshelves. And to my utter surprise, I discovered a book with Caleb Cushing's signature on it.
Ah,
So it's clearly dated to 1843.
1843.
And it is, the remarkable thing about this book is that it is written in a combination of Wanyan and Cantonese. And so it was clearly meant for a very small geographical market, the Cantonese speakers around the city of Canton.
Right.
And it is a pornographic fiction of the Jinping Mei, but not the original text.
Not the original text. Yeah, I'm not too surprised. I mean, it sounds like it was something that worthy of some study. But the Sibao people, I don't know too much fiction that they necessarily produced in Hakka. But that glossary I showed you, Ranjaryong, everyone every day, that. I don't know whether I'd say it's in the Hakka dialect, because it really is a glossary. It's a list of vocabulary words rather than something that is in full sentences and so on. But it has some terms that were local terms for certain agricultural implements that wouldn't be comprehensible to somebody who wasn't from the area. So that, I assume, is a text that was designed clearly for a Hakka readership. And there's another glossary they do, Yinian Shiyong Zazi, which is also like that. But most of their texts seem to have been for this very broad, Chinese readership. I mentioned the wooden fish books, the Muyu Shu. Those are in dialect. Or Chaozhou, produced in Guangdong, also produced these quite voluminous songbooks. I mean, 20 volumes. Again, in Chaozhou dialect, but my understanding, I don't know Chaozhou dialect, but I understand that they're still comprehensible to, say, a Mandarin speaker and reader. You just notice that there's some places where you don't understand, but you can still understand the story. Yeah. It's not prohibiting or preventing non-Chaozhou dialect speakers from understanding. But this is an area that I think deserves a great deal more study. Is the production and then the spread and the use of these dialect texts. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm asking because I've been looking at some reform primers dating from the 1890s to 1900s,
right,
which were explaining classical terms and sentences in Cantonese.
Oh, really?
In print. And the authors were self-consciously saying that this is an innovation that I adopted when I was traveled in Japan.
Really?
Okay. Now,
fascinating.
But if you are looking at these 18th and 19th century printing that might have been explaining classical sentences in Hakka, then what my Cantonese reformed Sishu people were not doing was not that innovative.
I would guess not. I mean, we know of texts in the Wu dialect. I mean, we're a different part of the country now. Yeah. Have you read Anne McLaren's book on Shangchanggushi, on Shang Fable in the Ming? She analyzes a text that is in Wu dialect, a printed text in Wu dialect that, again, is a performance sort of text.
A performance text is one thing, but a glossed textbook is something else.
That I have not seen. No, that may be something that's new in what you said, the late 19th century.
1890s.
1890s. That I don't know that it is, but it's quite possible. I haven't seen anything like that earlier. Yeah.
Well, my author was one of the refugees from the 100-day reforms.
Oh, really?
And so he spent a year in Japan studying Japanese elementary education. And he went back. He didn't dare go into China, so he was settled in Macau. And the books that he wrote there eventually sold all over the Pearl River Delta and overseas.
Okay, that would be fascinating. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about it if I could afterwards.
Yeah. No, I need to run.
Oh, you do? Okay.
But we could exchange email.
Email or something, because that does sound fascinating.
Probably not.
Okay.
Well, thanks. Sorry.
No. Thank you very much. I mean, again, I'm not linguistically equipped to deal with all the different dialects, but somebody should be doing this. It is fascinating, and it would give us a much richer picture, again, of what I'm calling Chinese book culture, which is obviously a rather broad term. So, yeah.
Is that, yeah, that's on. Thanks for a great talk. Now, I was really curious about the local resources you were talking about, very specifically about the paper and the inks. Now, could you, I would like to know more about the inks they were using, and were they produced locally, especially the colored, beautiful colored wood block you showed?
Okay. I don't know that I can answer that question. First of all, that text was produced in the lower Yangtze Delta region, and yes, those inks probably were produced in that area, but that remained a very, well, we're talking about the 17th century. That in the 17th century was the publishing center for the Ming, and then I think even in the early Ching. And that book comes out of this region that was famous for producing not only color printed works, but just exquisitely cut works. So, really the finest woodblock text, probably of the whole tradition. Well, no, you'd get people arguing with that, but some of the finest works were produced from that area. I frankly just don't have the technical knowledge to explain to you how those inks were produced. I can tell you about how the cheap ink that the Sibao people used was produced.
Yeah, that would be great too.
Pine soot. That there were two ways that I know of where you construct a kind of bamboo. It's like a bamboo tunnel,
right. And
then you burn. Well, you have to drain the resin from the pine, and then you basically burn pine wood and collect the soot. I'm sorry, you have to, well, that's the purpose of this sort of bamboo tunnel.
Right.
And then what seemed to be much more common in the early 20th century when I was interviewing people is, and again, this is when I don't think they needed all that much ink because the industry was dying. They say they would just take a wok and suspend it upside down over a fire, and lampblack, basically, producing lampblack that way. I think they also sometimes purchased ink, and that seemed to have been fairly easy to get on the market.
Would they have to go to the city to get the ink?
Would they have to go?
Would they have to go to the city?
No, because I think that's something that it actually was probably easier to produce in the countryside.
All right.
Any pine growing region. But the fancier inks, again, if you have a minute afterwards, I might be able to give you
Sure.
a reference of somebody who does know more about it than I. The paper is bamboo paper, and again, it's a bamboo paper producing area. Sibao's right in the middle. And some of the publishers, actually, some of the publishing lineages, some family members would sometimes work in the paper trade as well.
So that was another question, and that was I was very curious about was, were they predominantly using bamboo paper, or would they sometimes use rice paper as well?
The Sibao people predominantly, as far as I can tell, they always used bamboo paper. I mean, I'm not sure of that, but almost always. But of course, different qualities of bamboo paper, and they tended to use rather poor quality bamboo paper. Maobianzhi or liansuzhi was the higher quality. I don't know whether you're familiar with those terms. But of course, again, high-end publishers would use a much finer quality bamboo paper, or they might use paper made from mulberry bark. That was another very popular. And there are all sorts of different ingredients that could go into the making of paper. So.
Thank you for a terrific talk. You had one slide with an extraordinary image of a wood block, and it made me think of a 19th century stereotype plate. Oh. And then I started thinking about how much work would go into producing this. And I wondered, that made me wonder about cooperation between publishers, and I wondered if there was something like a stationer's register or courtesy, even an informal courtesy of the trade, or whether or not even maybe there was a guild. And here I'm thinking about, I realize these texts weren't very high quality, but still they must have wanted to maintain some level of quality, and also the issue of controversial texts. So I guess I'm wondering about publishers themselves and how they self-regulated, and how they protected the market for each other, so that publisher A didn't spend all winter carving a book, realizing publisher B had done exactly the same thing.
Well, there doesn't seem, it's very difficult to find information, and perhaps because it doesn't exist, about guilds or publishing organizations that are regulating this in any way. There's some evidence that there might have been such a guild in Suzhou, which is right in the heart of this lower Yangtze Delta area and one of the premier publishing centers in both the Ming and the Ching. But again, the information is rather sparse. In eastern Sichuan, I mentioned YCAR, which is really a community of block cutters. There's some evidence that there was some kind of a guild that was formed in the early 20th century, but the evidence I got for that was very contradictory. Some people said, oh yes, it was protecting the quality of the block cutting, and it was an organization for the cutters. To regulate the trade in some ways, but then some of the cutters I spoke to said, no, it was all for the publishers and they controlled us. They were trying to regulate the trade in a very different way. So it's very difficult to get really solid information, and the textual evidence for this sort of thing is very, very sparse. I think in terms of what happens within Sibao itself, because again, there are many, many, many different publishing houses within these two villages. And of course, they're often run by people who are related to one another. They also tended to intermarry quite frequently. And all sorts of arrangements could be made. You could rent blocks. I do have some documents that say, well, if one of your brothers wants to borrow your blocks to print a book, you just give them to him and lend them to him. But if anyone outside the family wants the blocks, you rent them, even suggesting what sort of prices might be charged. Blocks, of course, could be sold. Then, that's, I guess, fairly obvious. They could be mortgaged and pawned. So there are all sorts of ways in which they could be transferred. In terms of copyright, a lot of the Sibao books were what we would call pirated. They're just finding a book that they decide is going to be popular and that they want to publish, and they just have somebody rewrite the text and recut the block, but they're not paying the original publisher for the rights or purchasing the blocks. So that was quite common. But there is some kind of concept of what, again, we call copyright. I don't know what I would, well, it's called banquan, which is translated as copyright in Chinese. And that often you find, I don't think in any of the texts I've shown you, there's 4 characters that are often printed on the front cover of these books that says reprinting prohibited. Now, this didn't stop anyone, as far as I can tell. It was done all the time. But that does suggest that there was some idea that there should be some sort of protection. Some of them are quite entertaining. My favorite is, he who basically pirates this text, may his son become a thief and his daughter a whore. So all of these imprecations against anybody, and yet it was quite common that texts were pirated. In terms of government regulation, the local magistrate knew of the Sibao publishing industry because he writes a preface to one of the genealogies that talks about it. But as far as I know, there was never any government interference, and they did occasionally publish books that were outlawed by the government. I don't know that I'd call the book subversive, but Plum in a Golden Vase, a book that is considered pornographic, that was prohibited and they published it. Water Margin, the book that I said celebrated the bandit life, they published that. And that was every once in a while the government would try to prohibit that book. But I see no evidence that it had any impact whatsoever on the Sibao publishers. In another site I've studied, the local magistrate actually had a stone stele put up listing the titles of all the novels that he was forbidding the industry to publish. But again, I'm very skeptical as to how rigidly that prohibition or those prohibitions were enforced. So, I'm sorry, a rather rambling answer, but you've touched on things that we really know very little about, but would like to know a great deal about. Yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure, yeah.
At least I know from from my studies that Ma, especially in the Hui, stands for Muhammad.
Right.
So
yeah.
were these at least culturally Islamic group?
Yeah, I mean, that was when I discovered that this was their surname, that was my first thought, and I have to say I simply don't know.
Okay.
There is nothing in the genealogies to suggest that, but as you probably know, the genealogies, they talk about the origins of the lineage, and often that part of the genealogy is the most unreliable because it's often a kind of a fictionalized version. And indeed, their version is not at all clear as to the real origins of the lineage. But it is very striking that it is this surname that is so often associated with Hui or Muslim families.
And would you happen to know if the printing especially took like printed religious text, especially like in maybe in Arabic or in Chinese translation of, say, the Quran or something for those Islamic cultures? Would you happen to know if they were
in Sibao or just anywhere?
Anywhere.
Sibao, no. But anywhere, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know when the first Chinese translation. I mean, that would have been very.
That would have been around like I think the 9th, 10th century, I would assume.
Okay. I don't know of any examples. Again, this is another area that it would be wonderful to explore if you're interested in a topic, because we really don't know very much about the publishing of non-Han texts in China, except perhaps in the Ching. That people have worked on that.
Okay, thank you.
I have something of a simple question. I think in European history, historians have basically associated quite a few things with the rise of the print press, urbanization, modernization, rise of a literate middle class, and so forth. And this almost seems to be going somewhat in the opposite direction because these aren't large urban spaces that they're selling these books. And I'm wondering what can you glean about changes in social history, particularly in the countryside, from these examples?
Okay, well, just to go back a bit, because I perhaps gave you the wrong impression by not in my talk going back far enough. And you do have this, woodblock publishing is invented, we think, in China. Even that isn't all that clear, perhaps in the 7th century. And you have the sort of first real publishing boom, I would say, in China during the Song dynasty. So we're talking about, the Song dynasty begins in 960, but it's probably the 11th century when you really begin to get very active commercial publishing. Then there's this mysterious decline that takes place in the 14th and early, through the 15th century. And again, I won't go into all the details here, and then suddenly this enormous publishing boom that begins in the late 16th century. This is the late Ming publishing boom. And that is very much linked to urbanization, commercialization of the economy, the development, I hesitate to use the word middle class, but with urbanization, city dwellers, many of them merchants who are interested not only in the classics, but also in entertainment sort of texts and how-to manuals and so on. So that is very closely linked to the sorts of changes that you're talking about in Europe. And again, in the late Ming, the big publishing centers, with one exception, are these cities in this culturally most advanced and wealthiest part of China, the lower Yangtze Delta area. Again, there's one other site that is a rural site in northern Fujian. So that, in a sense, sort of fits the European model. But you're right. I'm kind of arguing that in the Ching, there's this other development. Now, it's not that the metropolitan sites stop publishing, they continue, but I'm just arguing that there is a greater diffusion of the impact on the countryside. That's awfully hard to tell. Again, I'm arguing for an increase in literacy, maybe not full literacy, but this clearly encouraged that. I'm arguing, for greater cultural integration, that now you have, again, possibly a peasant living in some mountain village in Guangxi province, far distant from any center, reading the same kind of primer that the, spoiled son of a very wealthy literatus in the lower Yangtze Delta area would be reading in very different editions, but nonetheless, you know, sharing some kind of culture. But that's pretty much speculation on my part. It's very difficult to prove that. And I guess I would identify the difference from Europe, and I'm not really answering your question, I'm going off on a tangent here, is the difference in technology. I think it was much harder to spread mechanized printing, you know, the Gutenberg kind of press, into rural areas, and whereas woodblock printing is very portable, you know, very, very easily transportable. So.
Are there any last questions? Any of you who've read Brokaw, my classes? I've got the real live author. You want to ask her a question? Sam?
No, no. You can ask me privately. Huh? that's. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I couldn't help noticing one slide you showed of the genealogy book of the Ma family. It seems the quality of the fonts and the printing quality in general is much higher. So I wonder, the family hired some other professional
interestingly, they don't print their own genealogies. They hire itinerant genealogy people who specialize in the publication of genealogies. One of the genealogies is actually done pretty clearly in movable type. And that was not at all uncommon, that you would have, again, a group of, in fact, it was quite common to use movable type for the printing of genealogies because there's so many repeated characters. And I understand that still in certain parts of rural China, there are these groups of itinerant genealogy publishers who will travel around to the different lineages that want a genealogy, and they have a store of wooden movable type characters that they're carrying with them, and then they do up the extra ones on the spot to suit, you know, the names that are needed to put in the genealogy, and that's how they were published.
So do you think the cultural meaning of these Sibao books is slightly different from the other books? Like, do they carry the same sort of cultural capital, or are the Sibao books considered as respectable or cherishable objects at the time? I mean, do we have any evidence? Or?
No. I mean, one of the frustrating things about the kind of work that I'm interested in is that it's very hard to find. All of the books I've shown you, I found at Sibao, or you know, there are some people who collect them, but they're not famous book collectors. They're just people who have a sort of local interest, so they've been collecting them. I've only found one book that is clearly a Sibao publication in a library. Now, there probably are others, but you know, I've only really found one in a library. All the others were ones that I collected on site when I was doing the field work. And sadly, from my point of view, librarians and again book scholars tend to be very contemptuous of these books, so contemptuous that they're not really preserving them. So you know, they're thrown away, they're discarded as junk. And you know, I understand their point of view. They are not beautiful texts, but they're throwing away, I think, very valuable sort of evidence for information on popular culture or literacy or whatever. But that is one of the challenges. I should say, I've developed quite an attachment to Sibao, and I, in their defense, to defend their honor, they were capable of publishing some fine texts. I don't happen to have a slide with me, but one of their publishers was actually an editor of some note, and he edited, do you know the text, Yoxue Gushi Chonglin? Okay, he's one of the editors of a sort of later edition of that text. He was also a very fine calligrapher. And they published what I think is kind of like a vanity edition of his calligraphy that is actually very nicely cut. So I think if they wanted to, and in a special circumstance like that, they were capable of producing a fine work. But, well, this sort of fits into my argument, which is they identified a certain market that didn't require, and in fact, they wouldn't have been able to sell to that market had they produced finer and more expensive works. Yeah, yeah.
One last question.
Thank you, Willie, for the fascinating talk. On the topic of that calligraphy, I was actually thinking about the function of images in those books. Well, the very amusing images that you showed us with the pictures and the words, I understand that they are for children to understand what they are. And I'm just wondering if there are any records of who would be the people who draw those images, and are they actually just copying from other books? Mm-hmm. And also another question is, did any of these, let's say, New Year prints was produced in Sibao?
Suba. Okay.
Thank you.
I know very little about the people who would draw or cut the illustrations. There's some people who argue that the scribe who does the calligraphy of the text and the people who do the illustrations are two different, and I'm almost positive that's the case when we're talking about a very elite, beautifully produced book, that there were probably two different sets of skills, and maybe even two different sets of cutters, of people who actually cut. But I don't know that that's the case in Sibao, and given the crudeness of the illustrations, I'm tempted to think that the person who wrote the characters, who was not a bad, some of the calligraphy isn't too bad, was probably also doing the illustrations not very nicely, not very, very well. But I don't know. The Nianhua. Any other standalone. I believe not. They don't seem to have done, well, the Nianhua would be quite large. Not that I know of, and my informants said no. I'd done some field work in Mianzhu, in Sichuan, where they specialize in the production of Nianhua. But it seems, from what I understand, it seems to have been a specialized. In other words, publishers who did Nianhua probably didn't do too many texts. Although, again, there is a text publishing industry in Mianzhu, so maybe I'm wrong about that. And then publishers who did text tended not to do the Nianhua, is at least my very preliminary understanding. So I think that also works in Tianjin as well. You get, but again, another topic that would be interesting to explore. Okay, thank you very much.